in our particular case, where we're just looking at this one MOOC, we're very interested in focusing on interaction. And by this, we're talking particularly about how people communicate in the discussion forums. The reason we're particularly interested in this is that when you think about how people come together in MOOCs, if you think about the very large number of people that come together from a wide range of different countries, then it's very interesting to think about, well, how do the forums then support that learning? How important are the forums in thinking about the learning process? And so what we're basically trying to do in this study is think about basically the different ways and reasons that people interact in these forums, and then trying to develop a series of interaction profiles that relate both to learner characteristics and also course outcomes. And as we've already heard today, course outcomes are quite hard to define, so we're thinking about that quite critically as we go through. Now, as we've already heard, there's been a huge amount of hype about MOOCs, about how they might transform higher education, how they might widen participation, but we really don't know a huge amount about them yet. And so the key motivation for us in doing this work really was to really understand the kind of realities of learning within a MOOC, to understand the kind of on-the-ground kind of experiences of people. And we also, as a team, there's a team of 5 of us between the Department of Education and the Oxford Internet Institute, and we come from a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds, and we're very excited about the range of data that you can get from MOOCs, so that you can start to connect all this digital trace data with more traditional social science methods like interviews and surveys, and we can start to connect those in really creative ways. But it also presents some quite interesting challenges as well. For us, when we were starting this project, widening participation isn't really the focus of our research or what we're trying to achieve, but we have collected an awful lot of data about learner characteristics, and so we're going to point to that as we go through this presentation. Okay, so as I said, we're looking at one particular case study of one particular MOOC, and it's a business course offered by a North American university via the Coursera platform. And this has a very strong emphasis on encouraging interactions between learners. And this is particularly useful, of course, for the kinds of research questions that we're interested in answering. We've got a very mixed methodology, as you can see from the big list there. We've got all the data of every kind of interaction that people participate in the forum. So we're looking at the visualizations of posts and views, we're carrying out social network analysis, we're doing in-depth interviews. We've done 10 so far, we intend to do some more. We have pre and post survey data, we've been doing some qualitative observations as people have been learning in these particular courses, and we've also done a substantial amount of content analysis of the forum posts. Throughout this project, which began in October last year, we've been moving a lot between quant and qual methods to really try and understand what's going on. And we found this kind of very mixed, iterative approach very powerful for thinking about our research. And we'd like to talk more about that a bit later. So just to tell you a little bit more about the course, it's a course about business strategies, as I've said. It's a 6-week course, and it ran from March to May last year. What's really nice is the course has run 2 times since that time, so we can actually test our ideas and hypotheses out on these secondary data sets as well. Students were required to sort of offer about 4 to 6 weeks of their time for this course, and they were required to do a couple of things. They had to complete the weekly quizzes. They also had to complete a final assessment that looked at a particular business problem and present a range of strategies. And they also had to discuss business cases in the discussion forums on a week-by-week basis. Now, the course obviously had videos, as we would expect, these quizzes and so on, but they had multiple subforums, and in those subforums people could discuss the relevant different aspects of the course. So we had forums on the lectures, a forum discussing the weekly cases, and the final project and so on. So it's a fairly straightforward course setup. Now, before I pass over to Nabeel, who's going to be talking particularly about participation in the sense of who interacts with who, I wanted to talk a little bit about the numbers and who actually has participated in this MOOC and their kind of characteristics and backgrounds. And so what we see is that over 90,000 people registered for this course, almost 50,000 actually used or viewed a lecture. We see that around 20,000 submitted at least one quiz. And we see the numbers dropping. 4,500 actually participated in the forum at least once, and 2,200 actually passed the course. Okay, so we see a huge drop, as we've already heard, from those who register to those who pass. But we need to think very carefully about, what does participation mean? Is passing the ultimate goal? What happens in between these numbers? And that's something that we're very interested in trying to understand. In terms of geographic location, what's interesting about this course is it does attract students from around the world, but there are some parts of the world that are better represented than others. So as we see, around 30%, a third of the course participants are from North America, 28% from Europe, 25% from Asia, and so on. And what's interesting, though, is that when we look at the forums, who participates in the forums and who participates in the course overall, there isn't a significant difference, really, in where people are from. In terms of education background, so we did collect some data about people's previous educational qualifications, and this was done by a pre-course survey. And as you can see, the number, we only have about 7,500 participants, so our kind of response rate to the survey is not great. So you really have to think about the quality of the data that you have. But what we can sort of assume from this, I think, is that, similar to many other MOOCs, is that these participants and these learners are a very highly educated bunch. So over 85% have at least a bachelor's degree, 45% seem to have a master's and a doctorate, or a doctorate. So the idea that lots and lots of people who have no qualifications who come into this MOOC is perhaps a little bit misguided, but there is some people there who only have some high school qualifications. But again, what we see, which is quite interesting, is that forum participants seem to attract people from a range of different educational backgrounds, similar to the course as a whole. The sorts of relationships are about the same. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Nabeel, who's going to talk about how people actually interact in these contexts.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. So, as Rebecca talked about, one of our objectives with the research was to basically build an understanding of how people are using the discussion forums. So we started with a pretty high-level view. We wanted to get an idea of what are some of the dynamics across the different discussion forums that we've talked about. So you can see here there's a study group subforum. So basically, the study group subforum was used to enable people to come and form study groups. So what we saw in this forum was a lot of people would say, hey, I'm from India. Is anybody else from India that wants to join a study group? Hey, I'm from Boston. Hey, I'm from some parts of South America. And so people would chime in and say, this is who I am. This is my background. Let's form a study group. So you can see here, these are some histograms which show on the x-axis the number of days since the course has started. And on the y-axis here, we basically have the number of posts or comments that were made in that discussion forum. So very characteristic of many of the other forums that aren't shown here. There's a huge peak of excitement and activity in the beginning. So lots of people are like, hey, this is who I am, really, really nice to meet you. And then very quickly, that interaction really dies down. So what's interesting here is there's a nice little peak here around the start of the second week. And so that's because latecomers joined the course and wanted to form study groups as well. But generally, after the second week, there's virtually no activity going on in that forum. As Rebecca mentioned, there are also weekly case discussions on different businesses. So for the first week, students were tasked with analyzing Google's business strategy. So they're presented a series of questions on should Google position itself in its competitive market, what recommendations do you have for Google, things like that. So every week there's a different company to analyze. So with cases, there's a more interesting trend. We're sort of seeing this weekly kind of spiking pattern, which you would expect because there are these weekly assignments, but it's sort of a dampening trend in some sense. And again, that's because there's less and less people who are engaging in the forums as the course moves along. We had this earlier, we didn't show this, but the final project subforum was interesting. Right the night before the final project was due, there was a huge spike in activity because there are lots of questions about what time should they submit it and all of that. So for me, it was an indication that procrastination is something that binds us all together, no matter what country you're from. So it's natural to kind of move from these broad trends to ask a question of how are people actually interacting in these settings? How are individuals and learners actually communicating? And so we use social network analysis for this. So I'm sure many people are familiar with social network analysis, but the basic idea is you have a collection of actors, which you model as nodes, and you're trying to understand the relationships or the interactions between those actors, which are modeled as links between those different nodes. So there's a number of questions, actually. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we even first formulate this network? Who represents the nodes? What do the edges represent? And once we came up with the formulation, we tried to ask the question of how good is that formulation? Before we try to do analysis on it, we wanted to understand and make sure that our model is actually robust and represents the data well. So we basically said people who are posting in each of these different subforms are the actors, so they're the nodes, and then we defined a connection between two actors if they are between two learners if they co-participated in a discussion thread together. So that's a very coarse definition, right? Just because I posted the first day and you posted the last day of the course, there's no reason to believe that we should be connected. There's no reason to believe that we actually exchanged information or had a meaningful interaction. So we were then tasked with the second question of how much do we trust that formulation? How much do we trust the fact that just because we've built this coarse definition or these links between people, it's actually indicative of some sort of meaningful connection or meaningful interaction? So to answer that question, we borrowed from engineering. We said, let's actually assume that the network we've built is just a noisy version of the true underlying network of learners. So it's some corrupt version or some one realization of how people could have interacted and how people should have meaningfully interacted. And so our objective then became which connections between learners are actually significant, which of them indicate some real underlying social connection or some sort of significant exchange of information. And so we can talk about this methodology afterwards if you're really interested, but at a high level, basically what happens is you sample a bunch of possible social networks, and then for each connection in the observed network that you built, you just do a significance test. You say, is this link significant given all of these possible networks that I've sampled? And if it is significant, you keep that interaction or that connection, and if it's not, you filter it out. So intuitively, what this does is it helps us throw away connections between learners that are attributable to chance, that may or may not indicate some sort of real underlying social interaction or social relationship, particularly if the people that have connected in one forum also happen to be participating in many other discussion threads. So there's, again, no reason to believe that just because they participate together once, that there's actually something meaningful happening. Of course, there's a flawed assumption under there, which is that significance is implied by frequency of frequency of co-participation, meaning just because you only participate once together, it's an insignificant interaction, which may or may not be the case, but ESIS will actually talk a lot more about some of the qualitative ways we try to validate this and why this might actually be a reasonable assumption to make. So when we run this process for all the different subforms, what we see is most of the discussions or most of the connections between people are filtered out as insignificant. And so what we can see, for example, in that study groups forum that I talked about, is that almost 3/4 of the connections between people are labeled as insignificant connections, likely because of the nature of people just chiming in and saying, this is who I am, this is where I'm from. The winner out of all of these is the cases subform here. So again, the cases were actually meant to encourage some sort of learning, and doing the content analysis so far has realized that there actually are different levels of learning being realized in these case discussions. And given that, it's interesting to see that the cases subform has the least number or least percentage of edges actually filtered out. Again, meaning there's actually meaningful learning and meaningful conversations that are happening, especially compared to the rest of the discussions. So this is just a picture of the study groups network before we filter out the edges. So it's a very dense network. And then once we filter out the insignificant relationships, it's a lot sparser, as you can see. So do we have any power systems engineers in the room? No. You always got to ask that question wherever you go, right? In power systems engineering, one question that's often asked is, I have an electrical network, and I want to know what are the important nodes in this network, meaning which nodes do I have to damage in order to cut off supply to the rest of the network? So we can ask an analogous question in this setting. If you think about why, so we've talked about interactions between learners, so another question to ask is, what role do different learners actually play in these social networks? And which are sort of the critical set of learners that are really binding together discussion in the different subforms? So if we ask that question, we can actually test and see how fragile or how vulnerable are the networks across these different subforms. So the way you do that basically is you say, okay, for each subform, let me compute the most central learner. Let me take that learner out, basically disconnect them from the entire network, and then see what happens to the size of the largest connected component of that network. So the largest connected component intuitively is really just how clumpy is this network. So if a network is really kind of bound together and there's not a lot of isolated discussions, but there's a lot of these learners are interacting with each other, it's a very dense network. And so what you can see is a lot of these different subforms actually start as very highly connected. But then, for example, for the study group subform, which you can see here with this dotted line, degrades very rapidly, meaning you don't have to take out a lot of people in that network for that network to completely break down. And again, that reflects sort of what we'd expect given the significance numbers we just saw earlier. But again, what's interesting is if we look at the cases subform, you can remove up to, it takes about 40% of the people, or removing 40% of the people before you actually see the degradation of that network, which it completely breaks down. So again, what this is telling us is, and this is a stretch statement to make, but you can interpret this in some sense as how democratic are these discussions, right? So if you think again about study groups, taking a few people out, even though it seems like there's a lot of interaction, taking a few people out completely breaks this network down. Whereas if you think about cases, it takes you taking out more people for the network to achieve the similar levels of fragility. So again, it's pretty interesting to see that the network that encourages or facilitates the most learning is also the least vulnerable. So it's something to think about as we think about maybe some of the different ways we actually interpret what these numbers actually mean. So just broadening out a little bit, in terms of thinking about who participated in the forums in terms of the final scores they actually received. So we talked about their low completion rates. If you look at the course as a whole, only 2% of course participants received greater than a 90%, which was 70% was the passing rate. So effectively, just over 2% of people who actually signed up for the course ended up passing, whereas 21% of, and almost over 25% of people who participated in the forums were people who actually passed the course and received a certificate. So you can't lie with statistics and say that the forums cause higher participation or higher learning outcomes or higher scores, but you can say that the people who are more intentional and care more about their performance in the course do participate in the forums, and Isis will really expand on that in a second. Just some more demographics about high score earners. So again, most of them, 60% of them were from the West, Europeans, North Americans. 45% of people in the forums who got higher than 90% had at least a master's degree. And again, in the context of this course, particularly an MBA. So again, they're not all white educated men over the age of 26, but a lot of them are very well educated, and they're the ones who are taking advantage of these opportunities to interact with others. So as we've seen, forums so far mostly harbor crowds and not communities. And the ties between learners are actually very tenuous when you get down to the level of what's being discussed. Participation in the forums is dominated by people who either did really well, so people who got above a 90%, or people who actually would have been considered failing the course. Again, well-educated people from the West tend to do the best in these courses, but there's still an underlying question. We've seen the structure of these different subforums. There's still an underlying question of who are the people that are participating, what are their inclinations, what are their backgrounds, and that requires a level of qualitative research that Isis will talk about.
Yeah, well, thank you. So let's see. Oops. All right. So yes. So as Rebecca has explained, we're really trying to combine quantitative and qualitative approaches to understanding how learning takes place and what characterizes the networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the qualitative evidence, and here I'm drawing on interviews we've done, data from interviews, and also from surveys of some open-ended questions, and also from quite extensive content analysis of forum posts. In the qualitative part, what we're trying to understand is really about, how do people experience learning in a crowd, and what motivates them in the first place, and also, as we've already talked about a couple of times, how do they define success themselves? And so we're starting to see some emerging patterns of learner types. Now, you can say, so we're identifying 4 learner types, and you can say the first 2, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, so don't worry if you can't read it, are very individualistic, not really interested as such in the crowd, whereas the number 2 and 3 embrace the crowd and see that as part of the learning experience as well. So to talk a little bit about the first learner type, we can think about this as just-in-time learning. So these learners are there because they have a specific project or problem that they're working on in their in a work context or in their general lives, and so for them the MOOC is about acquiring this knowledge that will help them make these decisions. So this is about individual learning. It's not about connecting with other people. And so they don't perceive of the crowd as having any significance whatsoever. I mean, they still do actually. All these people have actually posted, and we know that they viewed content because we can kind of connect the data sets. But they don't experience it as being part of it. And so learner type 2 is not that different. The difference there is in terms of their objectives. So they're there to increase their future employability. So these are people who reflect on what are my skill gaps and how can I better my professional profiling. So they don't necessarily tend to think of the crowd as something that's a rich resource. I mean, it is considered in some instances a source of information. But not more than that as such. And their key barriers is really, how do I manage my own time? How can I find time to, watch through lectures in the gym or on the go? Now, learner type 3 is then distinctively different. And they're distinctively different because they care about the crowd. For them, the crowd is really important for their learning experience because the crowd is a pool, and it's a pool that they can go to find and identify people. They can create communities in order to co-construct knowledge and in order to network. So, so these are the people we see, in the study forums being very, very active. And I would say, based on the qualitative data, it's not just a matter of, oh, we're really excited in the beginning. It's about, we're very excited about creating groups that we can meet with in platforms and venues that perhaps have better tools for collaboration. So, for instance, Lucas, who is a guy who is very much trying to generate groups and created Facebook groups and all these things. He said, I use the forums to connect with other students and then set up a group of tools and other platforms. And that MOOC, it gives a boost to your motivation. And it was all about trying to almost mirror or recreate more traditional formal educational experiences where you have a classroom, you have classmates and peers that you discuss course materials with. So here there's so some of the barriers for these learners are about finding the collaborative tools that work, because as we see in the content analysis of all these 15,000 posts, is that it's quite difficult to actually find information and find the right thread in the right form and so on. So finding other venues and still connect to the Coursera platform and so on, and managing all the logistics around, finding people in the same time zone who have share the same interest, might want to work on something similar for the final project. Now, the fourth learner type here, we could call it learning for learning's sake, are equally seeing the crowd as an important part of the learning experience. However, perhaps less so than type 3, they don't see it as a knowledge co-construction, but as a source of knowledge. So actually believing in peers' ability to provide knowledge with some sort of authority. So what we see here is it's about access to education and also about global outreach. So you can see, for instance, one of our interviewee here is Imengo in his early 40s. He's based in Nigeria, and he says, the world is getting smaller, so being a king in a small pond is no longer enough, because very soon the world will be coming into the pond. And if I interact with these people across border, then my knowledge also somehow has to be cross-border. So it's about making connections. It's about accessing knowledge, and that this distributed and multicultural environment of the MOOCs allows for that. Okay, so I think this is just the kinds of things that we are finding, and now I'll hand over to Rebecca so she can talk about how we move on.
Yes, very quickly. Sorry, we're so excited about this project. We've been talking about it for a long time. So, basically, although this project isn't particularly about widening participation, I think it is starting to throw up some really interesting ideas that kind of recognises, as we've already been hearing about this afternoon, the diverse learner needs, motivations, and their level of digital inclusion that really need to be considered if we're serious about thinking about MOOCs as a way of widening participation. I think for us, the qual and quant together has been an incredibly powerful way of starting to understand what's going on. And what we're hoping to do really is to both refine our kind of typologies of learners by bringing all of these data sources together, but what we also want to be able to do is eventually develop a set of quantitative metrics that could be used across a wide range of MOOCs, much larger data sets, to really start to profile learners, start to really understand different categories of learners, learner motivations, and then start to support those learners better. So it could not just be a research tool for those who've kind of collected data and have data to play with, but also in real time actually support educators in trying to better support their students that they're trying to teach. And I'll just end by saying some thank you to lots of other people. Chris Davies from the Department of Education, who's also working on the project, Bav, who's also been very kindly helping with coding all of these thousands of posts, and Taha Yasseri from the OI, who's our Big Data Officer here. The project website's there, and also thanks to our funder from the MOOC Research Initiative, who's made this research possible. Thank you.